Welcome and thanks for joining us today for our March Lunch and Learn. I'm glad you could be here and happy spring migration to everybody. I hope everybody's had a chance to be out and enjoying spring and a bit of migration. It's very snowy here in New Hampshire, but it's melting quickly and there's a ton of birds to be seen. I'm Julie Brown. I'm the Raptor Migration and Programs Director at HMANA, and we are excited to welcome Nora Honkomp today. She's a graduate student who's going to be talking about her research on the life history traits, seasonal weather, and fall migration timing of North American raptors. And we know migration timing is definitely a hot topic at hawk watches in light of climate change and sites reporting changes in migration patterns, certainly, and changes in weather patterns. So we're excited to hear about her research. I'm going to be facilitating things today with Jess Cosentino, and he is a HMANA board chair or HMANA board member and our marketing committee chair. And a few things we always start with before we start the program. We are recording. We're also live streaming on Facebook. So you can view any of these Lunch and Learn talks on our Facebook page afterwards or on our website just by scrolling down to our What's New section of our homepage. And if you need to adjust anything on your screen where the chat shows up or how you're viewing anything on your screen, you can click on the three dots in the top right corner. And I know most of you are probably familiar with this by now. But we have disabled the audio and video for everybody, and we found that's the best way to reduce distractions during the talk. Even though you're muted, we always really love to connect with you. So we encourage you to use the chat, ask questions, make comments. Jess is going to read your questions to Nora at the end of the program. And we love hearing just where you're joining from. So feel free to add that or what Hawkwatch you represent. And if you don't already receive our newsletter, our e-newsletter, it goes out once or twice a month, and we have a lot of upcoming programs and events and tours and things like that. So you can enter your email address into the chat, and we're happy to add you to that list. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Jess to introduce Nora.
Okay, yeah, sure. So Nora is a master's student studying raptor biology at Boise State University. She was first introduced to avian migration ecology during her undergraduate degree at Kent State University and has been seeking to learn more about it ever since. When she isn't coding or doing field work, she likes to rock climb, ski, and take new friends birding. And with that, I will turn it over to Nora.
Awesome. Thank you. First of all, thank you all for having me today. I'm really excited about this opportunity and to talk to you all and hear your feedback. I do want to give you a little bit of a heads up. This is the presentation that I gave to defend my master's thesis just a couple weeks ago. It went really well and I passed, which was awesome. However, I had to include a lot of details about statistical analysis so that my department could make sure I did my research pretty thoroughly. So just as a little bit of a warning, if it feels like I'm getting into some pretty nitty-gritty things, bear with me and I will get back to the biology of the birds pretty quickly. With that, I'll go ahead and get started. So migration is an important part of the annual cycle for many species. It allows organisms to increase their reproductive success by taking advantage of booms in seasonal resources, while still maintaining high rates of survival in the non-breeding season. Migratory organisms experience a broad range of conditions in the different areas they inhabit. So for example, the conditions in their breeding areas are very different from those in their wintering areas, and different from all of the places they travel through in between. In order to experience the best conditions, the timing for migration is really important. As you can imagine, an individual that arrives too early in the breeding area has risks of like cold snap or late season frost, whereas those that arrive too late might miss those peaks in resource availability. In wintering areas, individuals that arrive earlier get access to higher quality territories, which might put them in a better place for the next migration and breeding season. And then the places that they travel through in between, it's really important to optimize energy use on migration and decrease risks of mortality. In order to attain that ideal migration timing, we know that migratory organisms are primed at certain points of the year to physiologically prepare. This is done by things like their circannual rhythms, photoperiod, and their genetics. And then the actual time of departure is fine-tuned by many internal and external factors. For example, food availability, their body condition, the current conditions for travel, and their thermoregulation abilities. We live in a rapidly changing environment right now. So as you can imagine, the cues that species previously could rely on may no longer be predicting their ideal migration timing. And ideal migration timing itself is likely to be shifting. Let's consider an example. We're in the breeding area. It's time for spring migration. And the first thing that happens is the temperature begins to warm. This allows the plants to begin to grow, which creates the conditions that the migratory species are looking for. So they begin to arrive. With climate change, however, in many places we're seeing milder winters. We can think of this as like an earlier warm up. This leads to earlier green ups. And across the board, we're generally seeing that birds are arriving earlier in the spring. However, fall migration timing is having much more variable responses. Some species are advancing their arrival, or their departure, some are delaying it, some aren't changing. In order to predict the different changes that might happen with autumn migration timing, we first need to understand the cues that different species are using to determine their departure timing and the different factors that could relate to ideal migration timing itself. I don't need to explain this much to you all because you guys know that raptor migration is really well studied thanks to the fact that raptors are conspicuous diurnal migrants and they can be monitored at count sites. We've already documented shifts in passage timing. Here in North America, we're generally seeing delays in autumn migration timing, but in other places like Europe, some species are advancing their migration timing. So there's heterogeneity among the species. Several studies have tried exploring the different biological and environmental factors that could relate to these diversity of shifts, but really the underlying patterns are still not entirely understood. So before we can begin to understand the difference in shifts that are occurring, we first need to look at the cues that species are using to determine their departure timing, and the different factors that could determine ideal departure timing itself. So for this study, we were interested in a variety of biological factors. These are all life history traits that raptors have. Before I go through those, I want to point out that the way these life history traits might relate to departure timing could be related to any of those three areas that we talked about earlier, the breeding areas, the wintering areas, and the conditions for travel in between. So first, on the left-hand side, we're thinking about migration distance. Long-distance migrants have less predictive information about the areas they're traveling to, so this could affect their departure timing. Body size could be important for departure timing because larger-bodied species might have better thermoregulation abilities. However, they also probably need pretty ideal conditions for flight when they're traveling in order to optimize their energy use. Social behavior during migration could affect departure timing because species that travel in groups need some mechanism for meeting up and all leaving at the same time. Diet breadth could determine departure timing. More generalist species can take advantage of more food sources and potentially stay later into the fall. And then flight style could also affect departure timing because the conditions for travel needed by species that flap versus those that soar are different. All of these unique combinations of life history traits that each species has results in a diversity of relationships between environmental factors and departure timing. So here we're thinking about maximum temperature, minimum temperature, precipitation, and snow. And we know that these all could be important in the fall around the time of departure. However, we also know that there are carryover effects from events earlier in the annual cycle. So the timing of spring migration and the timing of breeding can affect the timing of autumn migration. So we also need to think about how these weather factors could be related to those earlier events in the annual cycle. For this study, we were interested in raptor departure timing across North America, and we had 3 big questions. First, what biological factors determine departure timing? Here we're thinking about those life history traits. Next, what environmental factors determine departure timing? We're thinking about those different weather conditions. And then last, we want to know, given these relationships, how might departure timing shift in the future? Let's look at the first question first. So within this question, we wanted to think about 2 aspects of departure timing. So first, we were curious which life history traits are important for species autumn departure timing within a season. So does the species leave early relative to others, or do they leave later? And then we were also curious which life history traits are important for variability in species autumn departure timing across space and time. So here we're thinking about, does the species leave at the same time every year, or does it depend on the year? And across the different regions, do they all leave at once, or do they leave at different times? For the first question, we took those 5 life history traits and we made predictions about how they might relate. So species that we expect to leave early would be those that are long-distance migrants, smaller bodied, social migrants, diet specialists, and those that soar during migration. Conversely, we expected the species that leave later be those that are short-distance migrants, larger bodied, solitary migrants, diet generalists, and use flapping flight. For the second question, we just picked 3 traits that we expected to be biologically relevant to this question. So we expected species that leave pretty consistently would be those that are long-distance migrants, diet specialists, and social migrants. And then those that have more variable departure timing would be short-distance migrants, diet generalists, and solitary migrants. The first thing we did was select 15 species of raptor. These are the species right here. The criteria for inclusion was that they had to have complete migratory breeding populations in the continental US and Canada. We then assigned those different levels of the life history traits using information from birds of the world. So in order to be a long-distance migrant, the species would need to have populations that wintered in Central or South America. If they only went as far south as the southern US, then they were considered short-distance migrants. For body size, we use the average adult female mass. Social behavior, we read through the descriptions of their migratory behavior, and if it described that they migrate in groups, especially those that kettle, those were considered social migrants, otherwise they were solitary. For diet breadth, we looked at the number of different types of food that the species commonly eats. And we created kind of a proportion. So higher values were more diet generous species and lower values were more diet specialists. And then for flight style, again, we read through the descriptions of their behavior, and if they were described as generally using active flight during migration, we considered them flapping, versus powered flight were thermals and soaring. That was the other category for flight style. Next, we obtained all of the eBird checklists from 2011 to 2021 in the US and Canada. We created a detection, non-detection data set. So this was just whether or not each species was reported on a checklist. We laid a grid across the US and Canada and sorted the lists into the cells based on their latitude and longitude. And we removed cells that didn't have enough data available, or if the species was present in that cell year-round. To calculate departure dates, we modeled the decline in probability of a species detection in the second half of the year. This was done using Bayesian generalized additive models, and we fit a different model for each cell, year, and species. But let's look at an example of that. So here we're just thinking about kestrels in one cell in 1 year. We have day of year across the x-axis at the bottom. These points at the top are showing us checklists where a kestrel was reported, and all of those points at the bottom are showing us checklists where kestrels were not reported. The black curvy line going down the middle, that's showing us the probability that a kestrel is reported over time. And in order to get a departure date from this, we found the day of year when that probability reached half of its maximum. So that's what the vertical blue line is here. You might notice there's some error bars on either side of this. That's because we fit each model 2,000 times. And for each of those iterations, we calculated a different half max. So we ended up with a distribution of departure dates from which we could calculate a mean and a standard error of departure. This was especially helpful for cases like these. On the left, we have a cell where there was a lot of data available and a really clear pattern of departure. So we get our departure estimate, and we know that it's really precise. On the right hand, however, we have a cell where there were very few data points available. So we could still calculate a departure date, but there's a lot of uncertainty around that estimate. Once we had all of our departure dates calculated, we built a Bayesian linear regression mixed model of departure date explained by our different life history traits. So we had departure date as our response variable with that uncertainty around it. We also included latitude in these models because we know that birds at more northern latitudes leave earlier than those at more southern latitudes. But we expected this relationship to be dependent upon migration distance. So we had an interaction between latitude and migration distance. We also included something called a sigma term. This is what allowed us to look at the variability in departure timing and to compare it to those three traits of interest. Once the model was built, we assessed its model fit using something called a k-fold cross-validation. And we calculated the mean absolute error and the R-squared. Okay, enough statistics. Let's look at some cool results. So we were able to calculate 5,439 departure dates. That's across the 15 species and 11 years. These maps are showing the distributions of data availability. So darker colors are cells that had more years of departure dates in them, and lighter colors were fewer years. These were really cool because in general, they line up with where we would expect each of these species to be a complete migrant and where we would expect there to be eBird data available. Next, if we look at the departure dates themselves, so each of these colors are the distributions of departure date for a different species. On the y-axis, we have date, so boxes that are down lower were species that departed earlier, and boxes that are higher were species that departed later. This was also really cool because in general, the departure dates matched the passage timing that's been described at migration count sites already. This was kind of like validating that our method did a good job of describing the departure timing. For our trait model, the model explained 10% of the variance in departure timing, and we were able to predict departure dates that were within about 16 days on average of the actual departure dates. These plots here are showing the effect of our different traits. The vertical lines are on 0, and so if the blue bar falls on the right side of 0, that means the trait had a positive effect. If it falls on the left side, that means the trait had a negative effect, and if it falls right on 0, then there's not a clear effect from that trait. Our plot on the left is showing the results of relative departure timing, so early versus late. And we saw that two variables had strong effects on relative departure timing. So latitude and its relationship with migration distance had strong negative effects. A couple of traits had tendencies in one direction or the other. So body size and social behavior during migration tended towards positive and negative effects. And then 3 traits had no clear effect. Flight style, migration distance, and diet breadth were centered on 0. Our plot on the right is showing the traits related to variability in departure timing. And this was really cool to see that all 3 traits had a strong effect on variability in departure timing. So let's look at each of these, starting with within season timing, so early versus late. we are looking at the relationship between latitude and departure timing. Higher latitudes on the right are leaving earlier than lower latitudes on the left. So these are like populations within the species that are breeding farther north versus those that are breeding farther south. However, that relationship was stronger for short distance migrants. So at higher latitudes, the short distance species are leaving earlier. We think this could be because they have pressure to get down to their wintering areas and establish territories because they need to compete with the residents in those areas. Whereas at lower latitudes, the short distance migrants don't have very far to go. They can hang around and take advantage of nice conditions for as long as possible. Long distance migrants, however, at more northern latitudes can't take off as quickly. They need longer to physiologically prepare for their long journeys, so they'll leave a little bit later. And at southern latitudes, they can't stick around as long because they have a long way to go. So they need to leave once they're ready in order to complete that journey in time. Next, let's look at social behavior and body mass. So on the left, we can see social species tended to leave earlier than those that are non-social species. This makes sense if social species are tending to use thermals. Thermals are more regularly available earlier in the year, so that might be why they're having an earlier departure. For body mass, just like we expected, larger bodied species tended to leave later than smaller bodied species. So again, this could be because they have higher thermoregulation abilities or because they need to wait for the best conditions in order to optimize energy use during migration. And then if we switch to variability in departure timing, now we're thinking about, do they leave consistently or more variably? For each of these plots on the y-axis, it says sigma. That's just telling us that higher values had more variability, lower values had less variability. So starting on the left with migration distance, just like we expected, long distance migrants had less variability in their departure timing. This would make sense if they're using more consistent cues, like photoperiod, compared to short distance migrants that are going to be maybe more in tune with the environment. For diet breadth in the middle, this plot is showing that diet generalists had more variability in their departure timing than diet specialists. This makes sense if they take advantage of different food sources between years. They would leave at different times, or across regions, if different populations are mainly using different food sources, those would be depleted at different times, resulting in more variability in their departure timing. On the right, we have social behavior, and just like we expected, social species have more consistent departure timing than non-social species. So they all need to meet up, leave at the same time, and that's probably happening at the same time year after year. To sum up how life history relates to departure timing, we saw that distance matters, but in combination with latitude. There were small effects from social behavior and body size that were in line with our predictions. Flight style and diet breadth did not have an effect, or they were not well captured in our analysis. So this could be, for example, flight style might not have an effect on departure timing because of behavioral plasticity. So birds will soar when they can, but they'll flap when they need to. And then for diet breadth, it's possible that the actual types of food that they're eating, as opposed to the number of types of food that they're eating, would be more important for determining their departure timing. So that would mean that trait is not well captured in this analysis. And last, we saw that variability in departure timing was affected by migration distance, diet breadth, and social behavior. That wraps up our first question. So now we want to look at the environmental factors that determine departure timing. And given those relationships, how might we expect departure timing to shift? For this, we selected the 4 species with the most data availability. So that was broadwing hawk, osprey, Swainson's hawk, and turkey vulture. We calculated departure timing the same way we did in the first analysis, but this time we had more data available, so we could go all the way back to 2002. We also selected a latitudinal band within each species range because we expected the effects of weather to be regionally specific. So here, we were curious which weather conditions are important in determining species departure timing and when. As a reminder, we were interested in maximum temperature, minimum temperature, precipitation, and snow. And we didn't want to make any assumptions about when in the year those variables were most important, since we know there's carryover effects from earlier events. I'll talk about how we explored a bunch of different time windows here in a moment. For this analysis, we didn't have any formal hypotheses because it was more exploratory and predictive. However, we did make some predictions about how we thought these different weather variables would relate to each species departure timing. And our predictions included factors that would relate to the breeding areas and to the conditions for travel mainly. Once we had the relationships with weather figured out, we wanted to know how might departure timing shift as those weather conditions change in the future. So for this, we used forecasted weather data under a potential climate scenario in the future. And we predicted shifts in migration timing. And so we were looking at whether the species were advancing, delaying, or staying the same over time. To do this, we obtained weather data from DayMet. This data set included daily measures of each of our 4 weather variables of interest. We summarized each variable within each cell across various time windows. I'll talk about how we picked all those time windows in a moment, but for right now, just know that there were a lot of them. For the temperature measures and for snow, we took the average of the daily average, the average of all of the daily measures within that window, but for precipitation, we used the sum. We then calculated anomalies of each of these measures. This was done by taking the average value of each variable in the cell across the time period of our study, and then subtracting that average from each year's individual value. This was done so that things could be relative to the region. So was it a generally warmer year, a generally cooler year, or an average year? Okay, I mentioned those time windows. This is how we picked them. So we started by picking a series of center days throughout the year. This was every 5 days from January 31st to November 27th. And then we added buffer days on either side of that center. So these also varied from 5, 10, 15, all the way up to 30 days. This meant that we had windows around each center day with durations ranging from 11 to 61 days. So a little over a week to 2 months. This picture up top is showing an example if we had our center day set at January 31st. Each of those gray rectangles is a different duration of window around that center day. As we start to advance through the different center days, you can see there's a lot of overlap. If you can imagine filling in this entire circle with all of our time windows, it would look something like this. So you can see we pretty much explored any possible time within the year that these weather variables could be important. Next, we used what's called a sliding window analysis because we wanted to test each of these windows to find the period that each weather variable best described departure timing. We used a model very similar to the trait model. It was a linear mixed model of departure date with its uncertainty, this time explained by just one weather anomaly at a time. And we also included latitude since we found that that was important in the first analysis. We assessed model fit the same way. And our goal here was to select the model that had the lowest MAE. This gave us one window for each variable for each species. So we found unique windows when each weather variable was most important for each species. We then took all of those species-specific periods and combined them into a full weather model for each species. Same exact model setup. This time it just had all 4 weather variables in it and latitude. We assessed model fit the same way. And this time we did some comparing between models to determine which weather variables were most important and if weather was important at all for determining departure timing. Once we had the relationships with weather figured out, we then wanted to predict potential shifts in departure timing in the future. So we obtained forecast data from NA Cordex. This data spanned 2011 to 2075. It was bias corrected for daymet, so that means it was comparable to the weather data that we were using originally. We had data for the measures of temperature and for precipitation, but there wasn't any bias corrected data available for snow. We used 7 regional climatic models, and we averaged across all of those. This is just like the thing you normally do when you're using forecasted climate data. Importantly, they were all RCP 8.5. So that means we're using a climate scenario when we're assuming that nothing was done to curb emissions in the future. We then calculated anomalies, the same as before, and we made sure to use the same average from the 2002 to 2021 data set so that the forecasted climate data was on the same scale as our original weather data. Last, we predicted departure dates across the next 50 years. This was surprisingly pretty easy. It was just like you built an equation and then you plugged in some numbers and you got departure dates out, which was really cool. So we used the average effect size from each species pool model for those different weather variables. And since we didn't have data for snow, it was kept at its average, which was 0. Okay, those are all of my methods. Now we're going to look at some results again. This table was pretty big, so I wanted to break it down for you. Each row is going to be a different species, so the different species full weather models. In the weather anomaly column, we have snow, maximum temperature, minimum temperature, and precipitation, and that's repeated for each species. The center and duration are describing the window that got selected for that variable for that species. Effect size tells us about the direction of the effect. And then the last 4 columns have to do with model fit, and I'll describe those when we get there. But let's go ahead and fill it in with all of the species. The first thing I want to look at is the different windows. So that center and the duration column. We can see that windows as early as April and as late as November got picked for these different weather variables. And the durations spanned different times as well. So as short as 11 days all the way up to 51 days were found to be important for different variables. The MAE is telling us the number of days on average between the predicted departure dates made by the model and the actual observed departure dates that we found. So these models were able to predict departure dates that were within about 10 to 15 days on average of the actual departure dates. In order to determine which weather variables were important for departure timing, we systematically took them out of the model and looked at how that MAE changed. So this column is showing us the change in MAE, and anytime there's a negative change, that's a good sign. It means it improved our predictions. So those variables were the ones that were considered important for departure timing. I'm going to go ahead and color code them real quick, just so you can see that all of the different weather variables were important to at least one species. All species had at least one weather variable that was important, all the way up to 3 for a couple of them. Yeah, I think that's actually all I had to say about those. So moving on for the R-squared, this is just showing us that osprey and turkey vultures models were pretty good at describing departure timing. They could explain 15 and 33% of the variance, but broadwing hawk and Swainson's hawk models were not so good. They had a negative value for R-squared, which is a bad sign. However, when we compare the R-squared values of these full weather models with those of models that only have latitude, that's what we'll see in the right-hand column here. And this is showing us that the R-square improves across all of the models when we add weather. So weather is useful for predicting departure timing. And actually, those 2 species that had the worst model fit had the most improvement when we added weather to their models. Okay, enough numbers. Let's look at each of those species. So on these next slides, I'll have in the top right corner a little calendar. This is showing when the weather variables were important for departure timing for that species. The colors are going to show you which weather variable it is. And then each of these plots will tell us a little bit about the effect. So for broadwing hawk, precipitation, maximum temperature, and snow were all important in the late fall. Precipitation had the effect that in wetter falls, broadwing hawks left later. For snow, when there was more snow, they left earlier. And then for maximum temperature, in hotter years, they left earlier as well. For osprey, the only weather variable that was important was maximum temperature in the fall. And we saw that in warmer years, osprey left earlier. For Swainson's hawk, precipitation was important in the fall. So in wetter falls, they left later. And then minimum and maximum temperature were important in the breeding season. So in warmer years, their departure timing was then earlier. For turkey vulture, minimum temperature was important in the fall. In warmer years, they left later. And maximum temperature was important during the breeding season. So in warmer breeding seasons, they also left later. In order to really understand what's going on here, we should look at these all at once. So in our picture on the right-hand side, each row is a different species. And we can see that there are diverse effects from the different weather variables, and different periods were selected across the different species. Maximum temperature was important to all of the species, but again, it had different effects depending on the species, and it was important at different times in the year. Interestingly, most of the effects fall during the autumn. And going through our predictions and thinking about how these might relate to the species biology, we expected some of them to be related to the living conditions in the breeding areas and others to be related to the conditions for travel. So for broadwing hawk, snow was important late in the year, and years with more snow saw earlier departures. So they're probably having a harder time finding food if there's more snow and getting out of there earlier. For turkey vultures, minimum temperature was important in the fall, so warmer years, they stuck around longer and they left later. For a few species, the conditions for travel were probably more important. For broadwing hawk and Swainson's hawk, years with more rain in the fall meant later departures. They're probably not sticking around because they like the rain. Instead, it could be that the storms and the weather events that are bringing all of that rain are making bad conditions for travel on a lot of days in the fall. And so they're having to wait longer until the conditions are better and leave later in those years with more rain. For broadwing hawk and osprey, maximum temperature both had a negative relationship. So warmer years meant earlier departure. And this could be because warmer temperatures bring more thermals, better access to better flight conditions, and so they're able to leave earlier in those years. The remaining time periods were during the breeding season, which was pretty cool to see. So the way we would expect the breeding season to affect departure is if conditions improve the pace of breeding, they're able to get the fledglings out of the nest faster, then they can start preparing for migration earlier and depart earlier. So for Swainson's hawk and turkey vulture, temperature was important during the breeding season. However, they had opposite effects. In warmer years, Swainson's hawk left earlier, but turkey vultures left later. This just highlights the fact that the effects of weather are really species specific. Okay, now probably the most interesting part that you might have been waiting for. We're going to look at the forecasts of departure dates. So on these graphs, we have year across the x-axis and date going up the y. The gray parts are departure dates that we've observed from our eBird data, and the pink parts are what we predict based on the forecasted climate data. So for broadwing hawk, over time, we expect to see a pretty stable pattern, no advancement and no delays. For osprey, we have maybe a slight advancement going on here. For Swainson's hawk, this one's definitely an advancement. And for turkey vulture, this one's looking more like a delay. You might be wondering why these are so, not such a small change. In order to really understand what's going on here, we need to look at the forecasted weather data underlying these. So these are the different weather variables at the time periods for each species. At the top, we have maximum temperature, in the middle is minimum temperature, and at the bottom is precipitation. If you remember, we didn't have any data for snow. So even though that was important for one of the species, we couldn't forecast snow. Precipitation was important to a couple species, but it doesn't really look like it has any directional change over time. So it doesn't seem like that would be contributing to any shifts. So those shifts are really just coming down to maximum temperature and minimum temperature. And if you remember, Swainson's hawk and turkey vulture had opposite effects coming from temperature, opposite directions. And so that would make sense why their departure timing is shifting in opposite directions. Okay, summing up weather and departure timing, we saw a diversity of weather conditions and periods important to each species, highlighting the species specificness of the relationships between weather and departure timing. And we also saw carryover effects from earlier in the year, like we expected could happen. The departure timing for these species in the next 50 years, we would expect to have either a small change or remain stable. This is surprising, given that we've already observed shifts in passage timing that are more substantial than this. So what we think could be going on here is even if departure timing is remaining pretty stable or not changing very much, we could observe greater shifts in passage timing if the species are altering their migration pace. So speeding up or slowing down to match the conditions that they're seeking. Also, from the first analysis, we saw that long distance and social migrants had low variability in their departure timing. So this could suggest that the species we selected may be less sensitive to weather than had we picked short distance migrants or solitary migrants. I do want to point out a few limitations from my analyses. Within the departure date calculation, we were only able to look at areas where the species were complete migrants and areas that had enough data available. This was because we can't tell from eBird whether an individual that's reported is a migrant or a resident in those areas where the species are partial migrants. Fortunately, eBird data availability is continuing to increase, so we could look at more regions in the future. Within the life history trait analysis, we had a small sample size for some of the traits. So for example, 4 of the 15 species were short distance migrants. In order to increase those sample sizes, we would need to include more regions in the analysis to include more species. And then for the weather analysis, we only included 1 period for each weather variable, when in reality, weather could be important at multiple times throughout the year. Despite those limitations, we provided support for multiple life history traits hypothesized to affect departure timing. We found associations between traits and variability, which underlies adaptability. We found species-specific weather effects on departure during unique periods in the year for 4 common raptor species. And given those relationships, we forecasted diverse shifts in departure timing. Overall, I think it's important that we continue to explore the biological and environmental factors that underlie events in the annual cycle, particularly migration, because migration not only affects the individuals and populations that undertake it, but the communities and ecosystems that they are a part of as well. It's also important that we continue to explore traits and factors that could relate to adaptability, as this gives insight into which species might be most vulnerable to future changes in climate. And last, we should keep exploring ways to improve predictions of phenological events and how they might change, because this gives us information that's useful for management and conservation, but also because it's pretty darn cool. Hopefully you agree. Okay. Last, I just want to thank all of the sources of open access data, the providers and contributors. That might be some of you if you like to use eBird a lot. Thank you for submitting your data. Also, thank you to DayMet and NA Cordex for the weather and forecast data. That is all I have. So thank you very much for watching, and I'm happy to take questions if we have time.
Wow, great. Thank you, Nora. That's amazing. Really. Thanks for sharing your research with our hawk watching community. I'm kind of blown away by the incredible wealth of information located in community science databases, that you didn't even have to go out and collect field data. I mean, there's so much you can do, and that we continue to be able to do with eBird. Hawk count as well. We're seeing a lot more data requests come in for just to be used in research. I'm curious if there's other people at Boise State looking at migration timing. Are there multiple people? Is it a popular topic there?
Not at the moment. It is just me, but hopefully others can use my methods or similar methods in the future here.
Yeah, are there other questions that were kind of uncovered in your research that that you'd like to see somebody pick up and explore more deeply?
Yeah, definitely. I feel like I really only honed in on one part of this question, and there's a whole migratory cycle to look at. I know spring is pretty well assessed, but I think it'd be really cool to look at with fall migration, like arrival in the wintering areas and other aspects of that, yeah, of fall migration.
That's great. Do you want to read off some questions, Jess?
Yeah, there are a couple already trickling in. Someone had asked, would it be possible using your system of analysis to compare osprey in the different migration corridors? For example, Pacific Flyway versus the aggregate data for all the corridors combined, which is what you showed. Yeah, that's the question.
Totally. And this was something my committee and I talked about after I defended, of like, we should definitely break it up at least into east and west, because we expect those areas to be affected differently. But it'd be cool to even do, yeah, the different flyways. I definitely think that would be possible. I would just categorize my cells into each of the flyways and then run different models for them, I think.
Yeah, great. Two people actually had similar questions pertaining to wind. The first one is, anecdotally, wind is an important factor in migration. Why didn't you include wind in your analysis? And then another person asked, did you consider wind speed and direction for weather influences?
Yeah, those are great questions. I, from the start, really wanted to include wind because I'd been reading a lot and hearing from folks like you all how important it is. Unfortunately, wind was a little more complicated to get data for, and so I wasn't able to include it just for the sake of time and trying to finish a master's degree. But in the future, if I keep exploring this question, I would totally include those different aspects of wind. Yeah.
Any other questions coming up, Jess?
That's it for right now. Maybe some folks are still waiting to type in their questions.
Yeah, I'm monitoring Facebook. We don't have any questions there. Is there a way we could read your thesis, Nora? Is there a way we could read your actual paper if people had more interest in exploring it further?
Yeah, good question. Not quite yet. I'm getting ready to submit these to journals. So
Great.
once they are published, please read them. Yeah,
Yeah, let us know. Let us know, and I'll share a link to our constituents. I think they'd be very interested.
great. Thank you.
There are a few more questions that just came through. Someone had asked, is it too far out to be able to compute the effects of extreme weather conditions like hurricanes?
That's a really good question. Probably has less to do with how far out and more about uh just the way that I was forecasting. I was really only looking at like average temperature, sum of precipitation, those kinds of things. But I think it'd be really important to look at severity of weather events because I'm sure that has a stronger effect than like those summarizations and averages. So I didn't, but I want to.
All right, great. Another person had asked, your graphs for migration timing change show less variability than the historical data. What is your take on that?
Yeah, those graphs are a little uh deceptive in that aspect. I didn't take the time to explain what it's actually showing. So the bars around the line in the center aren't the like confidence intervals or variability in our estimates. It just has to do with the how do I describe this? The number of cells that are being analyzed for some of the species, more cells could be analyzed, and so the width of the bar is just kind of like how many cells versus broadwing hawk and Swainson's hawk, since they're constrained to the east and the west, they had fewer cells, and so they had like a tighter bar around it. Hopefully, I write a really good figure caption for my publication.
All right, great. Another question. Someone just asked anecdotally, what do you think will be happening this season with these four species regarding timing,
I
especially
think
broadwing hawks?
I think I should ask you guys that question. I feel like I've been sitting behind a computer trying to picture what is going on in the real world, and really I just need to go spend some time out there. So that's my plan after my master's. Sorry, I don't have a prediction for you.
Okay, yeah, a few more questions just came through. A question about the eBird data.
Mhm.
Did you accept all reports, or did you vet them in some way for accuracy before including a report?
Yeah, great question. I did a whole bunch of filtering, a lot of vetting. I used, there's some publications out about kind of the best practices for using eBird data, and so I followed their recommendations on what to filter out. So for example, I only used complete lists, and I had some limitations on the duration of the list, that kind of a thing.
Okay, great. Someone had asked if will you be looking at other species like red-tailed hawks in the future?
Yeah, I am bummed that the four species that we had to look at with weather were all like long distance. Most of them were social. And I think it would be really cool to expand that analysis to species with more diverse traits, including red tail, especially since they're more short distance migrants. Our limitation there was just kind of data availability, but over time, more data will be available, and hopefully we could explore those other species as well.
Okay. Do we have more time for more questions, Julie?
As long as Nora's okay with it, yeah, we have another 6 minutes or so, so keep them coming.
Sure.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, great. Someone said, it's surprising that the precipitation doesn't change much in the future. It seems likely that at least in the West, precipitation is likely to go down.
Yeah, I was really surprised by that as well. I need to look back at the periods that were selected, like maybe if it's during outside of the time of drought. But that's one of the variables that I thought it would be interesting to look at extreme events, as opposed to like overall averages. So like really bad drought years or times that are, yeah, have really low precipitation.
All right. Someone just briefly asked to check, are you considering osprey as non-social?
Yes. Yeah. Most of the 4 species are social, except osprey. Yeah.
Okay. Someone had asked, what about the effect of forest fires?
I do not know, but I am very interested. I remember getting asked this question way back when I was doing proposal presentations. I think related maybe to how smoke would affect migration, but yeah, I'm curious to learn more about fire ecology and how it relates to migration. If anyone has any sources they want to throw my way.
And I think that kind of catches us up to speed for the moment. If anyone has any last questions.
Hey, those were great questions. Well, it sounds like you'll be getting away from your computer, Nora, with some Golden Eagle field work this summer. That should be fun.
Yes, I'm excited.
Well, we thank you so much for joining us today, and sharing your research. It was really interesting.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
And just to comment on next month's Lunch and Learn, we're still kind of narrowing down what's happening in April. We have a lot of plans set for summer, but we're just still firming up some details. So stay tuned for our April speaker and date. Just in other news, we do have our Raptor-thon going on now from March through May. So lots of teams have been registering this week, and I'm going to be getting their information up on the website. But if you want to learn more about the event, you can visit HMANA.org, learn how to create your own Raptor-thon team or show support for a current team. I've been doing it for 12 years now. It's an excellent way to support Raptor monitoring. 50% of all the money you raise goes to a hawk watch of your choice or conservation organization, and 50% goes to HMANA, which helps us kind of manage our programming, like our hawk count database, and 25% of it goes to our Hawkwatch Fund grants, which supports our site. So definitely check out Raptor-thon if you're interested. I know you're all going to go out and go birding anyway this spring. You might as well choose a day to do a Raptor-thon. It's really fun. And thanks everybody again for joining today and supporting our programs. You can always show your support for HMANA with a donation that helps outreach and engagement like this, like Lunch and Learn. You can join our kettle and become a member, and we're just really grateful for all your support. So I hope I get to see everybody again next month, and thanks again, Nora. And have a great day, everybody. We'll see you soon.